Imagine a cold September dawn in 1595. Fog clings to the Danube as 40,000 Habsburg warriors emerge like ghosts, cannons gleaming. Above, 3,000 Ottoman defenders stare down from Esztergom's ancient fortress, Hungary's spiritual heart, lost for 43 years. The guns are about to roar. Could Europe push back the Ottoman Empire? Mansfeld's massive artillery pounds the walls for days. Ottoman counterfire rages, but Habsburg guns prevail, cracking stone, creating a deadly breach. Relief cavalry charges from the south, but Transylvanian Hussars and field cannons shatter them on the plains. Pikemen and musketeers storm the rubble under withering fire. Street fighting engulfs the lower town. House-to-house chaos, every corner a kill zone. Numbers grind down the defenders. The citadel's gates creak open on day 5. Esztergom falls, proving Habsburgs could reclaim Ottoman Hungary. It shifts the Long Turkish War, paving the way to Vienna 1683 and redrawing Europe's map. A wound in the Hungarian soul heals. Want the full epic of cannons, cavalry clashes, and empire-shaking glory? Subscribe for the complete Esztergom saga. Hit play now. The morning of September 2nd, 1595, broke cold and gray over the Danube bend, a sky the color of old iron pressing down on a world that had forgotten how to breathe. Mist clung to the river in long, white fingers, reaching upward from the water as if trying to pull the heavens down. And in that mist, the outline of a fortress emerged, massive, ancient, impossibly high on its limestone throne above the river. Esztergom. The Hungarians called it Gran. The Ottomans had called it home for 43 years. And on this morning, all of that was about to change. Below the fortress, on the broad plains curling around the Danube's great bend, an army materialized out of the fog like a jeweled serpent uncoiling from a dream. Tens of thousands of men in plate armor and chainmail, pikemen marching in rigid columns, musketeers with their long matchlock barrels resting on their shoulders, cavalry riders whose horses exhaled great clouds of steam into the September air. Banners snapped above them in shades of crimson, gold, and imperial black. The two-headed eagle of the Habsburgs spread its wings over regiment after regiment, each company moving with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who have drilled beyond boredom into something deeper, into reflex, into faith in formation, into the bone certainty that the man beside you will hold. And at the river's edge, cannons, dozens of them, some so large it had taken 40 oxen to drag each one up from Vienna, sat waiting in their earthen emplacements like patient iron gods. Inside the fortress above, the Ottoman garrison looked down at this sight and felt something they had not felt in decades on the Hungarian frontier: genuine fear. There were perhaps 3,000 of them behind those walls, soldiers of the Sultan who had held Esztergom since 1543, who had watched this city become a pillar of Ottoman power in the heart of Europe. They had cannon too, and thick walls, and faith in a relief army they believed must be coming. But the force spreading below them across the muddy plain was not the scattered raiding column or the disorganized relief army they had hoped for. It was something else entirely, disciplined, purposeful, and enormous. 40,000 men had come to take Esztergom back. The stakes rising above this single moment were extraordinary, piling one upon the other like the limestone bluffs above the Danube. Tactically, Esztergom was the key that could unlock the entire Ottoman defensive system in Hungary, the fortress that guarded the road to Buda, the beating heart of Ottoman power in Europe. Strategically, its loss would signal that the Long Turkish War, barely 2 years old, was not going another round for the Sultan. It was shifting, trembling, perhaps even breaking. And at the civilizational level, what happened on this bend of the Danube in the autumn of 1595 would answer a question that Europe had been asking, often in terror, for more than a century and a half. Could the Ottoman tide, the same tide that had swallowed Constantinople, shattered the kingdom of Hungary at Mohacs, and stood before the walls of Vienna, actually be turned back? Not merely halted, not merely slowed, but genuinely, decisively reversed. This battle changed the Long Turkish War forever, and it began on a cold morning in September, when the fog slowly lifted over Esztergom and the cannons opened fire. To understand what it meant for a Christian army to stand beneath the walls of Esztergom in 1595, you have to understand what Esztergom meant, not just as a fortress, but as a wound that had been bleeding in the Hungarian soul for more than half a century. The city sat on the great bend of the Danube, where the river sweeps suddenly southward, guarded by a limestone hill rising some 80 meters above the water. For centuries it had been the seat of the Archbishop of Hungary, the spiritual capital of the kingdom, the place where Stephen, the first Christian king of Hungary, had been born and crowned in the year 1000. Its cathedral had been one of the grandest in Central Europe. Its castle had been a royal residence. In Hungarian memory, Esztergom was not merely a city, it was the heartbeat of the nation. The Ottomans had taken it in 1543, barely 17 years after their catastrophic destruction of the Hungarian army at Mohács in 1526. At Mohács, the flower of Hungarian nobility had been cut down in a single afternoon. The young King Louis II had drowned in a muddy stream while fleeing, and the medieval kingdom of Hungary had effectively ceased to exist as an independent power. What followed was decades of partition. The Ottomans controlled central Hungary, including Buda, the old capital. The Habsburgs held the western and northern rim, and the semi-autonomous Principality of Transylvania carved out an uncertain existence in the east, playing the great powers against one another with varying degrees of skill and desperation. By the 1590s, this partition had hardened into a kind of grim permanence. 2 generations of Hungarians had been born who had never known a unified kingdom. The Ottoman frontier, a ragged, violent line of fortresses, raiding parties, and burnt villages, had become the defining fact of life across a vast stretch of Central Europe. The Habsburgs, who ruled as kings of Hungary from Vienna, had made their peace with this reality through a series of truces and tribute payments that made many in the empire quietly sick with shame, but kept the peace. The Ottomans, for their part, had grown comfortable in their Hungarian strongholds, establishing administrative systems, building mosques and bathhouses inside the captured cities, and treating the occupation as permanent as geography. Then, in 1593, everything broke open. The trigger was almost absurdly small. A dispute over border raiding and local grievances near the fortress of Sisak in Croatia, where an Ottoman force was routed by a Habsburg defensive army in a battle that should have been a footnote but became a flashpoint. The Ottoman Grand Vizier Kocha Sinan Pasha, smarting from the humiliation, demanded war. Sultan Murad III, aging and increasingly isolated in his palace but still capable of authorizing catastrophe, agreed. The Habsburgs responded with their own declaration, and so began what history would later call the Long Turkish War, or, in Habsburg documents, the 13 Years' War, a conflict that would grind on for a full decade and more, consuming treasuries, armies, and populations across the breadth of Central Europe in ways that reshaped the political map of the region. In its first 2 years, the war had been a catalogue of reversal and counter-reversal. Ottoman forces raiding deep into Habsburg territory, Habsburg forces launching their own offensives, fortresses changing hands in a rapid, disorienting sequence that made the frontier feel like a living thing, contracting and expanding with each campaign season. But by 1595, a significant shift was beginning to crystallize. The Habsburgs had found new resources and new allies, and those allies mattered enormously. The Wallachian prince Michael the Brave had risen against Ottoman dominance south of the Danube, opening a second front that Ottoman planners had not fully anticipated. And the Transylvanian prince Sigismund Bathory, charismatic, unpredictable, genuinely fierce, and possessed of a theatrical personality that made him either inspiring or infuriating depending on the day, had broken from the Ottoman orbit in a dramatic reversal that sent shockwaves through the chancelleries of Istanbul and Vienna alike. Sigismund had allied himself with the Habsburgs, pledging troops and territory, and his own personal presence on campaign. For the first time in the Long Turkish War, the Habsburgs had something resembling a coalition capable of taking the war seriously into Ottoman-held Hungary. Most importantly, Emperor Rudolf II, a man more comfortable in his art collection than on a battlefield, but genuinely committed to recovering Hungary from the Ottomans as a matter both of strategic necessity and of imperial prestige, had dispatched a genuine expeditionary force north to the Danube. Not a patched-together frontier defense, but a serious European military expedition, equipped with heavy artillery and organized according to the most current principles of siege warfare. The man entrusted to lead this expedition was Karl von Mansfeld, a German-born military commander of considerable experience and considerable stubbornness. He had fought in the Low Countries under varying banners during the wars that had consumed that region for decades, in France during the religious conflicts that had torn that kingdom apart, in campaigns across the patchwork of European warfare that defined the last quarter of the 16th century. He understood sieges, how to build them methodically, how to press them patiently, when to pause and reassess, and when to push with everything available. But he was also 60 years old, exhausted by a lifetime in the field, and suffering from an illness that his contemporaries described variously without fully diagnosing, but which was clearly serious. Karl von Mansfeld carried his army toward Esztergom in September 1595, knowing he might not live to see the outcome. He went anyway. That single fact tells you something essential about Karl von Mansfeld. Alongside Mansfeld commanded figures who understood the Hungarian theater from the inside, men whose relationship to this conflict was personal in a way that no imported German general could claim. Sigismund Bathory himself had marched north with his Transylvanian forces, contributing cavalry and infantry and the fierce energy of a man who had thrown everything into his alliance with the Habsburgs and could not afford to lose. Hungarian commanders, men whose families had been fighting on this frontier for 3 generations, who had grown up with the smoke of Ottoman raids visible from their childhood windows, brought intimate knowledge of terrain and enemy behavior that no mapmaker could replicate. And beneath all of these commanders, the army moved, a multinational force of Germans, Hungarians, Walloons, Italians, Spaniards, Transylvanians, and whatever other nationalities the Habsburg war machine could assemble on short notice. Soldiers bound together not by shared language or shared faith in all its particulars, but by shared pay and shared purpose. Inside Esztergom, the Ottoman garrison was commanded by Kara Ali Pasha, a man whose name means Black Ali, a designation more likely referring to his complexion or the color of his armor than to any moral quality, though in the accounts written by his enemies, the darkness of the name acquired a convenient symbolic weight. He had fewer men than the besiegers by a ratio of roughly 15-1, but he had the walls, the height advantage, and the certainty that the Sultan's system would respond to a siege of this fortress the way it had always responded to serious threats, with a substantial relief army dispatched from the south to break the encirclement before the walls could be brought down. Relief armies had broken sieges before. They had broken sieges under conditions that looked even more hopeless than this. Kara Ali Pasha looked at the army spreading across the plain below him and made his calculation. Hold the walls long enough, and the Sultan's forces would arrive. It was not an unreasonable plan. It just turned out to be wrong. What makes Esztergom in 1595 remarkable is not merely that a fortress fell. Fortresses fell constantly in this war, but that it fell so quickly, so decisively, and in the teeth of everything the Ottomans could bring to bear to prevent it. In the calculus of the Long Turkish War, it was a seismic event, a proof of concept that the Habsburgs and their allies could not only resist Ottoman power in Hungary, but actively overcome it on the offensive. The ripples from those walls coming down would spread across decades, shaping the trajectory of a conflict that would ultimately determine whether the Ottoman presence in Central Europe was permanent or temporary. But before any of that, there was the work of taking them. The ground around Esztergom was not made for easy warfare. The Danube at this point is wide and powerful, sweeping around the great bend in a curve that geography and geology had collaborated to create over millions of years. The limestone hill on which the castle sat, the Varhegi, the castle hill, was not merely steep, it was nearly vertical on its northern and western faces, where the rock dropped almost directly to the river below. Anyone approaching from the north would have to cross or flank a substantial body of moving water before they could even begin to think about the walls. On the eastern and southern sides, where the hill sloped more gradually toward the lower town, Ottoman engineers had spent 4 decades reinforcing the natural advantages of the terrain. The outer walls were thick, built in an older style, but strengthened with earthen backing that absorbed cannonball impact better than bare stone. The inner citadel, perched at the hill's summit, commanded views in every direction for miles, which meant that any approach to the walls would be visible to the defenders long before it arrived, and anything visible to the defenders could be targeted by Ottoman artillery. There was also the problem of the lower town. The settlement at the base of the hill, a labyrinth of narrow streets and whitewashed buildings that had been slowly Ottomanized over 5 decades, mosques and minarets rising where churches had stood, the smells of the bazaar mingling with the smells of a garrison city, sat between the fortress hill and the river in a way that complicated any direct assault from the south. An attacker coming from the plain south of the city would have to fight through those streets before ever reaching the castle walls. The Ottoman garrison had made both the approaches to the lower town and the approaches from the lower town to the upper fortress as inhospitable as possible. Positions reinforced, fields of fire established, every potential approach under observation. Karl von Mansfeld studied this problem with the methodical care of a man who had made sieges his life's work. He had spent weeks before the army moved, gathering intelligence, consulting maps that were often inaccurate in important details, interrogating deserters and refugees who had been inside the fortress or knew its terrain, sending his own reconnaissance parties forward to observe and report under the cover of the cavalry screen. What emerged from this process was a picture of a serious defensive challenge that could not be solved by boldness alone. It required artillery, specifically the heavy siege artillery that could bring down stone walls from a distance, the technology that had been remaking the science of fortification and the art of siege warfare for over a century. Mansfeld had secured an impressive artillery train, assembled from the arsenals of the Habsburg Empire with the urgency that a major strategic objective demanded. Contemporary accounts describe the siege guns in terms that convey awe as much as specification. Some of the pieces were among the largest cast in the mid-16th century, monsters of bronze capable of hurling stone balls weighing 50 or 60 pounds against walls that had been designed to resist much lighter bombardment. The logistics of moving these weapons from Vienna to the Danube bend were staggering. Hundreds of oxen, thousands of wagons, supply chains that had to be maintained under the constant threat of Ottoman raiding cavalry operating from the south. That the guns arrived at all, and in sufficient numbers and with sufficient powder and shot, was an organizational achievement that reflected the serious investment the Habsburgs had made in this campaign. The army itself was organized along the principles that were reshaping European warfare in this final decade of the 16th century. The pike and musket had become the dominant infantry formation, long blocks of pikemen providing the defensive spine and shock capability against cavalry and other infantry, musketeers on the flanks providing the firepower that only gunpowder could deliver, the two arms working in coordination that demanded both training and tactical intelligence from the regimental commanders who had to manage the combination in real time. Mansfeld's German and Walloon regiments were experienced in this system. Some of the German units had been drilling it for years in the Low Countries wars, where the evolution of the formation had proceeded fastest. They moved with the confidence of professional soldiers who know their business. The Hungarian cavalry were different creatures entirely. Lighter, faster, built for the fluid raiding and skirmishing warfare of the Ottoman-Habsburg frontier, rather than the set-piece discipline of Western European battle. The Hungarian Hussars in particular were a distinctive force, armored lightly enough to move at speed, armed with sabers and bows and pistols, trained from childhood in the kind of mounted combat that the frontier demanded, which was essentially a form of controlled chaos. They provided critical reconnaissance and screening capability throughout the campaign's approach march, and they would become essential in the mobile combat that any Ottoman relief attempt would necessarily involve. Without the Hungarian cavalry covering the flanks and monitoring the southern approaches, the siege operation would have been dangerously exposed. The artillery positioning required careful thought and careful work. Mansfeld chose the southeastern approaches for the main battery, where the ground allowed the heavy guns to be brought into range of the outer walls without requiring a river crossing in the initial phase. Parallel trenches were begun, the classic siege approach that had been standard engineering practice since at least the previous century, inching forward under the cover of earthen parapets that protected the digging parties from Ottoman musket fire and counter-battery artillery. It was brutally slow work. The limestone beneath the thin topsoil resisted the shovel and the pickaxe almost as stubbornly as it had resisted armies for centuries. Men died in the trenches, picked off by sharpshooters on the walls above who had excellent elevation and fields of observation, hit by the occasional counter-battery shot from Ottoman guns that were still serviceable and well supplied with powder. But the trenches moved forward, yard by yard, day by day. The great siege cannon were dragged into position with the grinding labor of hundreds of men and teams of oxen, leveled and adjusted with the precision tools that gunners had developed over decades of practice, loaded with the careful ceremony that working with large quantities of black powder demands. And they waited for the order to open fire. The Transylvanian contribution to the siege operation is sometimes underappreciated in accounts that focus primarily on the Habsburg military achievement. Sigismund Bathory had arrived with a force that was smaller than the Habsburg contingent, but disproportionately valuable in certain roles. His cavalry covered the eastern and southeastern approaches to the siege lines, screening against exactly the kind of swift mounted probing that Ottoman relief forces would use to test the besiegers' perimeter. His infantry, experienced in fighting Ottomans on the Transylvanian frontier, where the character of warfare was somewhat different from the Hungarian theater, contributed a practical knowledge of Ottoman tactics that was less common in the German and Walloon regiments. And Bathory himself, whatever his personal eccentricities, and they were considerable, was a genuine fighter whose presence animated his men in ways that a hired general could not replicate. There is a scene described in several contemporary accounts, with the usual caution that all such narrative scenes from this period deserve, since contemporaries frequently invented or embellished dialogue and detail, of Mansfeld and Bathory meeting in the command tent on the evening before the main bombardment was scheduled to begin in earnest. The older German general, by all accounts already showing the physical deterioration of his illness, marked positions methodically on the siege map spread before him on the campaign table. The Transylvanian prince, half his age and with the theatrical energy of a man who had staked everything on this alliance, paced behind him, arguing for a more aggressive timetable, a faster assault, a greater willingness to accept casualties in exchange for speed. Mansfeld, characteristically, said very little in response. He simply pointed through the tent's open entrance at the fortress walls visible in the dying September light. He pointed at the guns in their earthen batteries below, and he said, in whatever words he chose, in whatever language they shared, essentially, "The walls will answer for us. When the guns have done their work, we will do ours." That night, before the bombardment was to begin in earnest, the camp settled into the uneasy quiet that camps always find on the eve of major violence. Across tens of thousands of campfires, men prepared themselves in the ways that soldiers have always prepared themselves the night before battle, cleaning weapons, checking equipment, writing letters that might or might not find their way home, praying with varying degrees of conviction to whatever version of God they carried with them. The German mercenaries played at dice and drank the rough wine that supply wagons had brought north, talking loudly about past campaigns in the way of men who are trying not to think about tomorrows. The Hungarian Hussars moved among their horses with the particular tenderness that cavalry soldiers develop for their animals, checking hooves and checking tack, and speaking in the low, murmuring way that horses seem to find reassuring. The Spanish veterans, some of whom had fought in the Netherlands and Italy and North Africa before finding their way onto this particular campaign in this particular corner of Europe, sat in small, quiet groups talking about things that had nothing to do with the siege, harvests, women, the way home feels after a long time away. A priest moved through the camp offering confession, and the line was long. Not because all the men were devout, some were not, but because confession on a night like this was simply the only ritual equal to what everyone in the camp already understood. That morning would bring fire and blood, and none of them could say with certainty which ones would still be breathing when the sun went down again. Inside the fortress above, the Ottoman defenders had their own rituals. The muezzin had called the garrison to prayer 5 times that day, as he called every day, the call floating out over the Danube and the plain below in the particular haunting cadence that the call to prayer carries in the open air. The garrison prayed, maintained their weapons, calculated their powder reserves against what they expected to need, and waited. Kara Ali Pasha is reported in later accounts to have walked the walls twice in the evening light, speaking to his men in the calm, direct manner of a commander who has decided that projecting certainty, even certainty he does not entirely feel, is part of his duty. He told them what garrison commanders in impossible-looking situations have always told their men, that help was coming, that their duty was to hold until it arrived, that God was with those who served faithfully. Whether he believed all 3 of those things is something we cannot know across 4 centuries. What we know is that he ordered the fires banked early and the men to rest. He would need them alert. The morning came cold, as September mornings do on the Danube bend. The guns open. The first cannon fired before full dawn, a single massive report that rolled across the Danube plain and echoed back from the limestone hill like the voice of something enormous clearing its throat. Then another gun, then 6 more in quick succession. Then, as the September sky brightened from black to deep purple to the iron gray of a day that meant serious business, the full Habsburg artillery battery opened simultaneously, and the sound was not a collection of individual explosions anymore, but a single sustained roar, a physical pressure in the chest that you felt before you processed it with your ears, a sound that men who survived the siege would describe for the rest of their lives as something less like thunder and more like the earth deciding to speak. The cannonballs struck the southeastern section of the outer wall with a force that visibly staggered the structure. Dust and stone chips erupted from the impact points. The wall seemed to flinch, as if even limestone and mortar had nerves. The Ottoman defenders, shaken from whatever sleep they had managed, scrambled to their positions, and they moved fast, because these were experienced soldiers who had drilled this kind of response. But even experienced soldiers need a moment to process the difference between knowing a bombardment is coming and feeling the first cannon shot shake the stones beneath your feet. Their own artillery answered within minutes. The deep-throated bark of Ottoman bronze cannon hurled iron and stone back down the hill at the siege works below, shots kicking up gouts of earth where they landed in the trenches, occasionally finding the gap between earthen parapets and killing or maiming a gun crew in the spray of soil and stone that an impact throws in every direction. But the Ottoman fire, though fierce and accurate in places, was outmatched from the beginning. The Habsburg artillery was heavier, more numerous, and positioned with a geometric precision that reflected decades of accumulated siege engineering experience. The Ottoman guns were answering a bombardment they could not match in weight of metal or in volume. They answered anyway because there was nothing else to do. By mid-morning, the outer wall's southeastern face was visibly suffering. Not in the dramatic, instantaneous collapse of romantic imagination, but in the patient, inexorable way that stone submits to repeated impact, cracks spreading outward from impact points like frozen lightning bolts in the masonry, sections beginning to bulge outward as the internal structure behind the face was compromised, mortar dust drifting down in thin gray curtains, fragments of carved stone from the older decorative elements tumbling away. The defenders worked frantically behind the wall to shore up the damage, dragging timber beams into place, piling earth against the weakening sections, doing the exhausting labor of repair under fire that garrison soldiers in every siege have always had to perform, knowing that what they fix today will be destroyed tomorrow, and they will have to fix it again. But the walls were not the only focus of Mansfeld's operation. While the main bombardment drew the defenders' eyes and energy toward the southeastern face, working parties in the forward trenches were creeping closer to the lower town on the southern approach, using the noise and distraction of the artillery exchange to advance their positions without triggering a major response. The plan was deliberately layered: soften the outer defenses with artillery while simultaneously advancing infantry close enough to exploit whatever breach the guns could create. It was standard siegecraft, but executed with a coordination and precision that reflected the hard-won lessons of a generation of European warfare conducted at exactly this kind of professional level. The Ottoman relief forces strike. The Ottoman relief attempt came earlier than expected. On September 3rd, less than 24 hours after the major bombardment had opened in earnest, Ottoman forces from the south made contact with the Habsburg screening forces on the plain below the fortress. The relief army that had been assembled from the Ottoman garrisons and mobile forces of the regional system was not a full grand army dispatched from Istanbul. Istanbul had not had time to mobilize a major expeditionary force, but it was substantial nonetheless. Estimates from contemporary sources range from 12 to 20,000 men, a force that was cavalry-heavy and built for the rapid movement that the situation demanded. Their mission was clear and urgent: break through the besieging army's perimeter, reach Esztergom, resupply and reinforce the garrison before the walls came down, and demonstrate that the Ottoman frontier system still had the capacity to protect its own. The encounter that followed on the plain south of the fortress was savage and swirling in the way that most cavalry-dominated engagements of this period tended to be. Not a clean, disciplined clash of formed bodies, but a fluid, constantly shifting fight across several miles of ground. The Ottoman cavalry hit the Habsburg and Transylvanian screening forces with their characteristic explosive speed and aggression. Curved swords caught the autumn light. The high, rising cry of the charge filled the air above the plain. Horses at full gallop covered ground at a pace that compressed distances and decisions simultaneously, giving commanders fractions of seconds to react where they needed minutes. For a moment, for several frightening moments, the screen seemed to buckle. The Transylvanian light cavalry gave ground in the controlled fashion of men who know the difference between a tactical withdrawal and a rout, maintaining cohesion under pressure, drawing the Ottoman riders forward and northward. But the relief force had ridden into something it did not fully anticipate. The besieging army's perimeter was not simply a ring of men. It was an interlocking defensive system that Mansfeld had established with his characteristic methodical care, taking into account exactly this kind of attempted penetration. As the Ottoman cavalry pursued the retreating Transylvanians, they rode into the range of artillery pieces positioned specifically to cover the southern approach. Not the heavy siege guns locked into their prepared positions and directed at the walls, but lighter field pieces that Habsburg engineers had sighted and crewed with an eye toward precisely this kind of situation. The field cannon opened fire from angles the Ottoman commanders had not fully computed, and the effect was immediate and brutal. Horses went down screaming in the particular way that wounded horses scream, which is a sound that stops men in their tracks if they have not heard it before, and haunts men who have heard it for the rest of their lives. Formation discipline shredded at the impact points. The charge, which had looked like a sword thrust aimed at the heart of the Habsburg siege lines, became instead a cavalry milling in confusion, units losing contact with each other, officers shouting orders that competed with the noise and the panic. The Transylvanian Hussars saw their moment. They wheeled back onto the disorganized Ottoman cavalry with the timing that only riders who have done this many times before can manage, striking the flanks of the relief force at the precise moment of maximum confusion, when the forward momentum of the Ottoman attack had been broken, but the orderly withdrawal had not yet been established. The fighting on the plain was ferocious and close, sabers against sabers, the shorter percussive report of pistols fired at nearly point-blank range, as riders grappled and cut and wheeled in a melee that covered miles of ground and resolved into hundreds of smaller individual engagements happening simultaneously. There was no coherent narrative to it from inside. It was the chaos that cavalry combat always becomes when two experienced forces meet in open country, and neither one breaks immediately. By late afternoon, the Ottoman relief force had been bloodily repulsed. It had not broken completely. These were experienced soldiers, and their retreat was tactical rather than catastrophic. But it had failed in its essential purpose. It had not reached the fortress. The garrison of Esztergom would not be reinforced. The siege would continue on the besiegers' terms. Inside the citadel above, Kara Ali Pasha heard the distant sound of that cavalry engagement, followed by the gradual, unmistakable diminution of Ottoman battle noise and the continued hammer, hammer, hammer of Habsburg artillery resuming its work on his walls. He understood what had happened without needing a messenger to tell him. The relief had failed. He was alone now, with however many men remained behind the crumbling sections of his outer defense, behind walls that the guns below were weakening by the hour. The calculation he now had to make was not, can we hold until help arrives, but something much starker and much harder to answer. The breach. 3 days of bombardment had done what heavy siege artillery was designed to do. By September 5th, a section of the outer wall on the southeastern face had been reduced to something that no longer deserved to be called a wall. It was a tumbled mass of stone and earth and shattered timber, a ragged gap perhaps 15 to 20 feet wide at its broadest point, and 3 to 4 feet above the surrounding ground at its lowest, the rubble spilling outward in a fan that would make the footing treacherous for infantry trying to storm through at speed. The breach was not clean. Breaches never are. But it was a breach, and in the logic of siege warfare, a breach changes everything. It turns the essential equation of offense and defense upside down, making the attacker's numbers an advantage rather than an irrelevance. Inside the fortress, the defenders had spent those 3 days doing what defenders with any sense of their craft always do when the wall starts to go: frantically constructing a secondary position behind the section under attack. They could not stop the outer wall from falling. They could make the space behind it as lethal as possible. Timber barricades went up, heavy beams salvaged from GDK fortress, whose structural contribution GDK was now less important than their value as material. Earthen ramparts were thrown up with whatever manpower the garrison could spare from the other walls. Firing GDK were established, looking down into the approach to the breach from the higher GDK of the inner fortress, so that any attacking force coming through the GDK would be channeled into a killing zone. This kind of interior defense, called a retrenchment in the military vocabulary of the period, was standard practice and often effective against a breach assault. More than one siege had seen attacking forces storm a breach only to be cut to pieces in the space beyond by defenders who had used the time of the bombardment to prepare exactly this reception. Mansfeld knew this. He had seen it at other walls, in other countries, in other campaigns. He planned accordingly. The assault on the breach would not begin with infantry charging across the rubble. It would begin with 2 hours of concentrated artillery fire directed not at the wall, which had already been breach-adjacent, but at the interior space beyond, the areas where the defenders would logically have positioned their retrenchments. The guns shifted their elevation. The shots disappeared through the breach and landed in the courtyard and interior spaces beyond. The defenders behind their barricades pressed themselves into the earth and endured it, knowing that when the guns stopped, the infantry would GDK. Then the guns stopped. The silence lasted perhaps 10 seconds, maybe 15. In that silence, which men later described as the loudest thing they had ever heard, more deafening in its way than the cannon itself, the assaulting columns moved. German pike and musket companies came first, in tight blocks, the long pike shafts leveled forward over the shoulders of the men in front, the musketeers on the flanks already blowing their slow match to bright orange life in the last seconds before the run. They came across the rubble fan at a trained, steady pace, not the wild, screaming charge of romantic imagination, but the disciplined, controlled advance of men who have drilled this particular movement until it lives in their muscles rather than in their minds. The rubble underfoot was treacherous, loose stones that twisted ankles without warning, half-buried beams that caught boots and sent men sprawling, the torn earth still smoking from the last artillery impacts, releasing a hot, acrid smell of burnt stone and disturbed soil that mixed with the burning match cord and the sulfur of spent powder still hanging in the air. Then the Ottoman defenders above opened fire. The musket volleys from the retrenchment positions were concentrated and devastating. Men in the front ranks fell, some cleanly, dropping straight down, others stumbling and tumbling over the rubble in the awkward way that bodies fall when the muscles receive no further instructions from a brain that has just stopped working. But the columns kept moving. Surviving pikemen closed the gaps, literally stepping over fallen men to maintain the block, and the musketeers on the flanks returned fire, the white blooms of black powder smoke mixing with the dust of the disturbed earth until the breach area became a thick gray fog through which men moved and died by discipline and reflex rather than by sight. The Ottoman retrenchment held for almost an hour. It held because the defenders were experienced soldiers, and because they had built their secondary position with professional care, and because the ground between the breach and the retrenchment was exactly as lethal as they had designed it to be. But it could not hold forever against the weight of men behind the attack, and the officers who pressed regiment after regiment through the gap with the grim arithmetic of siege assault knew this. The break, when it came, was not dramatic. It happened in sections, the defenders falling back from one position to another by increments, trading ground for time, pulling toward the upper fortress and the inner walls, fighting through the lower town. When the retrenchment finally broke, not all at once, but piece by piece, the defenders withdrawing by fighting withdrawals that kept the attackers honest, the battle moved into the lower town, and here everything changed. Street fighting is nothing like siege fighting. Where siege work is patience and calculation and the slow, grinding application of superior resources, urban combat is intimate chaos, immediate, directionless, savage in a way that no amount of drill or experience fully prepares a soldier for. You train for it in abstract, but you cannot train away the specific shock of turning a corner and finding yourself a yard from a man who is trying to kill you with a blade, of fighting in an alley barely wide enough for two men abreast, of having no idea what is happening 3 streets over, or whether the men who were beside you 10 minutes ago are still alive. The streets of Esztergom's lower town were narrow, convoluted in the way of medieval cities that had grown organically over centuries rather than been planned by anyone, and they were filled with the accumulated debris of 5 decades of Ottoman occupation and recent combat. Buildings that had been Ottoman residential structures or merchant establishments or small mosques now had their ground floors occupied by defenders firing from shuttered windows and loopholed walls. Minarets, the highest points in the lower town, gave Ottoman sharpshooters angles of observation and fire that commanded entire street intersections. Every doorway was a potential ambush. Every courtyard was a killing ground. The Ottoman defenders who had broken from the retrenchment did not simply flee to the upper fortress. They fell back by sections, covering each other's withdrawal in the disciplined, incremental way of soldiers who have been trained in exactly this kind of fighting, using every corner and every collapsed wall and every doorway as a position to slow the advancing infantry, forcing each unit to fight for every 30 feet of ground before moving to the next position and doing it again. Each block gained cost blood. Each street corner had to be cleared the hard way. But numbers have their own logic. 40,000 men pressing against 3,000, even in terrain that favored the defender, even in the narrow streets where those numbers could not all be brought to bear simultaneously, eventually produce an outcome. Mansfeld's regimental commanders were professionals who understood how to manage a fighting advance through urban terrain, exploiting every weakness, reinforcing wherever the advance was gaining, keeping pressure continuous so that the defenders never got the respite they needed to reorganize. Slowly, street by street and building by building, the lower town was taken. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky and began its descent toward the western hills. The fighting was constant and costly, and gave no one on either side the satisfaction of a clear, decisive moment. It was the grinding, incremental work of clearing a defended urban area, measured not in dramatic charges, but in doorways forced, and rooms cleared, and alleys secured, measured in men who would not be standing at the end of the day. By midday on September 6th, the fighting had reached the base of the castle hill. The Ottoman defenders who remained, fewer than 1,000 men now, many carrying wounds, all exhausted in the deep way that comes from days of continuous defensive combat, had retreated to the upper fortress, the citadel on the hill's summit that had always been the core of Esztergom's defenses. They still held the commanding high ground. The citadel's walls were thicker and in better repair than the outer defenses had been. But they also held a fraction of the men they had started with. Their powder reserves were depleted after days of expenditure, and the heavy guns below could be repositioned to fire up the hill if needed. Everyone in that citadel knew the arithmetic. The negotiations, if they deserved to be called that, were brief. Kara Ali Pasha sent an emissary down the hill on the afternoon of September 6th. The Habsburg commanders received him. The emissary asked what terms would be offered. The response, from Mansfeld or from whoever was conducting the negotiation in his name, was the standard terms of the period: surrender the citadel, lay down arms, and the garrison would be permitted to march out with their lives intact. No massacre, no looting of the interior by the attacking troops, just departure. Some Ottoman sources suggest that Kara Ali Pasha initially refused these terms, that he was prepared to die in the citadel rather than surrender on conditions he found dishonoring. There is something believable about this version, the image of a garrison commander in an impossible situation choosing death over terms that carried a sting, in Ottoman military culture, that went beyond mere physical defeat. But the version supported by most Christian contemporary accounts, and by the outcome, suggests that practical calculation ultimately prevailed. The garrison was too depleted, too exhausted, too low on powder, and too certain that no further relief was possible. On the morning of September 7th, 1595, the gates of the citadel of Esztergom opened. The Ottoman defenders came down the hill in columns. They were still armed, still in their military dress, still maintaining the posture of soldiers rather than prisoners, because the terms permitted them this dignity, and because Kara Ali Pasha understood that how his men walked out of this fortress mattered, that the manner of their departure was the only thing left in his power to command. The Habsburg forces that lined their route of march watched in silence. There was, by most accounts, very little cheering. The campaign had been long and costly enough that the soldiers who watched the Ottoman garrison depart had no appetite for celebration. What they felt seems to have been closer to relief, the particular, exhausted relief of men who have survived something that could have gone differently and are beginning, slowly, to believe that it is over. Esztergom had fallen. After 43 years, the spiritual capital of Hungary was back in Christian hands. The battlefield that remained when the Ottoman garrison had marched away into the autumn haze was a document written in rubble and ash. It told the story of the siege as clearly as any chronicle, if you knew how to read it. The outer wall's southeastern section was simply gone, replaced by the rubble fan that the assaulting columns had crossed on the morning of the attack. The lower town was a maze of shattered structures and blasted streets, the narrow alleys choked with the debris of urban combat, broken weapons abandoned by men who had nothing left to fight with, scattered equipment dropped in the haste of withdrawal, and in the darker corners of buildings and behind overturned market stalls, men who had not survived the fighting through those streets and would not be going home. The interior of the citadel, when Habsburg officers entered it, told the story of the siege's final phase in its own particular language. Food stores reduced to almost nothing, powder magazines nearly empty. The walls of the garrison quarters marked in places with Arabic inscriptions that the victors could not read, but that someone, at some point during those last days, had felt compelled to write. A name, perhaps, a prayer, a last record of having been present in this place. The human cost was significant, though the numbers available are frustratingly imprecise in the way that 16th century casualty figures always are, reflecting the chaos of the record-keeping as much as the chaos of the events themselves. The Ottoman garrison had suffered devastatingly. Of the 3,000 to 4,000 defenders who had begun the siege, contemporary accounts suggest that roughly a third were dead by the time the citadel surrendered, killed in the bombardment, the retrenchment defense, the street fighting, and the various assaults on the outer works. Many more were wounded. The survivors who marched out, perhaps 2,000 men at most, were in poor condition, visibly exhausted and carrying the particular weight of soldiers who have defended as long as defense was possible, and who know that their defeat will be felt far beyond the walls where they stood. The Habsburg and Transylvanian attackers had paid their own substantial price. The assault through the breach and the street fighting in the lower town had been costly. Estimates suggest somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 men killed or wounded in the direct assault phases, with additional losses in the cavalry engagements against the relief force on the plain. The trenches had claimed men steadily throughout the bombardment phase, picked off by Ottoman sharpshooters who had excellent angles from the fortress height, caught by counter-battery fire, worked to physical breakdown by the labor of moving siege works through limestone-bedded ground. These were not numbers that made the victory feel cheap. They were the price of what had been accomplished. Karl von Mansfeld did not have long to enjoy what he had built. He was already seriously ill when the campaign began, and the exertions of the siege had accelerated whatever was destroying him. Contemporary sources describe him as barely able to stand at points during the final week of operations, conducting the campaign at times from a litter carried by his staff, refusing to be moved to the rear despite the obvious and worsening deterioration of his health. He had made his career on fortresses. He would add one more to his final accounting, and then he was gone, dying in the campaign's aftermath, the exact date uncertain in the sources, but the circumstance not. Mansfeld died of his illness shortly after the fall of Esztergom, the siege his last act of professional life. He was identified afterward in the way that military men often identified fallen commanders in this period, by the particular marks that distinguished his body from the anonymous dead: a scar, an old wound, the face familiar to enough men still living to confirm who lay there. But the confirmation was a formality. Everyone knew he was dying. The fortress itself, when Habsburg and Hungarian officers walked its interior in the days following the surrender, was both more and less than they had expected. The years of Ottoman occupation had changed the place profoundly in ways that a military victory could not immediately undo. The great medieval cathedral that had once made Esztergom the spiritual heart of Hungary was ruined, damaged not in the siege, but in the long decades of occupation, a victim of neglect and the particular indifference of conquerors to the religious and aesthetic inheritances of the conquered. The Archbishop of Esztergom, the office had been maintained in exile for 5 decades, a peculiarly Hungarian compromise between survival and principle, would eventually return. But the city he returned to was a ghost of what the Ottomans had taken, itself a ghost of what had been. Rebuilding would take generations. The Danube, below the fortress hill, moved on as it always had and always would, indifferent to human events on the limestone bluff above. On its surface, late-season leaves drifted southward. The autumn was advancing rapidly, as it always did on the Danube bend, and the campaigning season that had produced such a dramatic result was drawing to its close. But the news from Esztergom was already moving faster than the current. Riders carrying dispatches had left the moment the citadel gates opened. In Vienna, Emperor Rudolf II received the news within days. In Istanbul, the Sultan's court received it with the silence that accompanies unwanted information, the kind of news that sends advisors looking at the floor and leaves even the most articulate men temporarily without words. The world had shifted. Not enormously, not all at once, but in the way that matters most, in the direction of things. The fall of Esztergom in September 1595 did not end the Long Turkish War. Nothing ended it quickly. It would grind on for another 11 years before exhausting both sides into the Peace of Zitvatorok in 1606, a treaty that settled almost nothing definitively and left the underlying tensions precisely where it had found them, buried barely below the surface of an exhausted peace. In that sense, Esztergom was not a war-ending victory. It was something smaller and, perhaps, more important. A proof. It proved that the Habsburgs could mount a serious offensive against Ottoman power in Hungary, not merely defend against Ottoman attacks. It proved that the Ottoman frontier system, the interlocking network of garrison fortresses that had held the line between the Sultan's Europe and the Emperor's Europe for more than 5 decades, was not impenetrable, that a sufficiently organized and resourced assault could crack it open and make the cracking permanent, at least for a time. And it proved that the tide which had seemed so inexorable at Mohács, so unstoppable when Constantinople fell, could be measured and calculated and pushed back. Not easily, not cheaply, but back. The political reverberations were immediate and felt across the whole of the conflict's complex diplomatic landscape. In Transylvania, Sigismund Bathory's alliance with the Habsburgs was vindicated, at least temporarily, by the shared success at Esztergom. In Wallachia, Michael the Brave's resistance to Ottoman dominance gained credibility from the example of what had been accomplished on the Danube. Across the Catholic world, the fall of the fortress was received as evidence that the Ottoman advance into Europe had genuinely stalled, that the civilization which had been contracting under Ottoman pressure since 1453 could expand again, could reclaim what had been taken, could push the frontier line back in the direction it had come from. Pope Clement VIII, who had been working to construct the anti-Ottoman Christian alliance that the 1595 campaign represented, saw in Esztergom a confirmation of his strategic vision. In military terms, the siege contributed to the ongoing development of how European powers approached the problem of reducing defended fortifications in the gunpowder age. The patient, systematic approach that Mansfeld employed, the careful positioning of heavy artillery to maximize its effect on specific sections of wall, the methodical advance through the trenches, the deliberate exploitation of the breach, the integrated planning for relief army interference, reflected the developing science of siege engineering that would reach its fullest theoretical expression in the work of Vauban a century later. Esztergom in 1595 was not the origin of these ideas, but it was a significant and successful demonstration of their effectiveness under real-world conditions against a capable and determined defender who had every reason to fight, and did. For Hungary itself, the capture carried a meaning that transcended military calculation entirely. Esztergom was not just a fortress. It was, as we noted at the beginning of this story, the spiritual capital of the kingdom, the city where Hungarian Christianity had been born and where Hungarian national identity was most acutely rooted. To have it back, however incompletely, however damaged, however temporarily, was to touch something deep in the Hungarian consciousness that no purely strategic analysis can fully capture. The archbishop would return. The cathedral would be rebuilt over long generations of effort and expense. The memory of what the city had once been, kept alive through 52 years of exile, could begin the slow, painful work of reunion with the place itself. The Ottomans counterattacked. They always did. In the years following 1595, the war continued its grim oscillation. Esztergom itself would change hands again before the conflict finally wore itself to exhaustion. Nothing in the Long Turkish War was simple or permanent. But the capacity for permanence, for a Christian power to take Ottoman territory and hold it, to push the frontier line back rather than merely defend where it stood, had been demonstrated in a way that could not be undone by subsequent events. That demonstration mattered for what came after, for the Great Siege of Vienna in 1683, which would finally and definitively break Ottoman power in Central Europe, for the slow Habsburg advance through the 18th century, that would push the Ottoman presence back toward the Balkans and eventually out of them. The chain of consequence runs from Esztergom through Vienna to the modern map of southeastern Europe. It is a long chain, forged in a September morning's cannon fire on a limestone hill above the Danube.